afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here in Portugal to talk to you about why I think decentralization is so important to our lives and to our future. We live at a time when it is critical for us to think about the technology that we are building and to think about what that technology does and how that technology can enable different kinds of futures for us. There is one way where the technology that we build is going to bring us down the road of a future society where everything that we own, everything that we do, everything that we interact with is somehow controlled and surveilled and owned by somebody else. I wanted to do just a quick exercise. Looking at my phone, you all might want to look at your phone just briefly. So on my phone, I have the following applications. I have Twitter, I have Facebook, I have Instagram, I have Uber, I have my airline application, I have banking, I have Venmo, I have everything from the weather to Google Maps. So this is all financial data, this is location data, this is in some cases healthcare data. This is all different kinds of information about me personally, where I am, what I do, what I'm saying, that is being translated and sent up into basically cloud services owned by somebody else. I don't own any of that stuff, and neither do you. And that's something we have to keep in mind as we build technology and as we try to scale technology for the future. It's of special importance for me to deliver this talk and share this story with you today in Portugal because your country is something that is very inspiring to others on the topic of decentralization. You may not think of it this way, but honestly, as someone who has a political science background, as a history background, as someone who's very interested in the history of democracy, obviously the Carnation Revolution is very famous around the world, and it's very inspiring to a lot of people. So it's exciting for me to be here to talk to you about this today. At the outset, I wanted to point out that we are at a crossroads. So one way is we can continue to go down this path that we have built for ourselves, where all of our information is owned by someone else and controlled by someone else. And that may not be that bad if you live in Portugal. There may not be ramifications for that if you live in Portugal. But if you live in a place like, for example, Angola, then there might be some ramifications for that. You have to consider that not everybody gets to live in a relatively free country that has rule of law and very low corruption by international standards, and that has multi-party politics. Most people, about 4 billion people, live in a very centralized world where one person, one king, one feudal lord, one military dictator controls everything. And that is a very dangerous combination when you have highly centralized technology. So that's one way that we could go, and it would be a very depressing way to go for so many people around the world who don't have the same rights and freedoms that you enjoy here in Portugal. The other way we can go is we can leverage new technology to build a decentralized foundation for our world. And the way we can do that is by taking the ideas and concepts behind democracy and behind decentralization, and by exploring how we can get there using technology and mathematics and economics. If you consider governance, it took humans thousands of years to figure out how to create distributed, decentralized governance. We always used to live in a hierarchical, top-down society, right? Ever since the agricultural revolution, we always lived in a hierarchical, top-down society. Now, thousands of years ago, the seeds were planted for something slightly different. Of course, in ancient Greece, some of these ideals, like rule before the law and having an independent judiciary, were created, and they were experimented on over and over again through hundreds of years. Now, what eventually ended up happening is that through several different revolutions across the world, whether it was Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution, we developed the tools and skill sets to hold our governments accountable and to start distributing some of that power. So today, you might want to be optimistic about the fact that nearly 4 billion people live under what I would call decentralized governance. So I think we have a lot to take with us as we move forward, And the big challenge is, what do we do as we start to enter this world where our phones and our devices and all of the interactions that we have an increasingly important role to play in our world? It's no longer just going to vote. It's no longer just reading the newspaper. Our interactions with each other are now highly controlled by other people. And we have to figure out how to build a slightly different world. So I think there's been like an issue backstage with some of my slides. So I'm just going to keep going in the direction that I normally go in, and hopefully they can fix that when they get a chance. There has always been an impulse by governments to control and to surveil. I mean, this dates back hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So in Europe several hundred years ago, you had the concept of the panopticon. So have you all ever seen the panopticon? This is a sketch that the philosopher Jeremy Bentham came up with here in Europe several hundred years ago. And the idea was for a government to be able to put all of its critics into one place. So here we go. This is the panopticon. And what would happen is, in this dream scenario, the government would get to put everybody that it didn't like in the panopticon and get to spy on them at all times. Obviously, it was a bit of a dream, or rather a nightmare perhaps for the citizens, but it's something that governments have always tried to do, right? So what happened is some governments actually built a panopticon. So this was actually built off the island of Cuba like 100 years ago, right? So it obviously has fallen into obsolescence, but the idea of like omniscient surveillance has evolved, especially in the world's largest country. So in China, which I don't want to pick on, but I want to use as an example because it is the largest country in the world where there are more than 1 billion people today. And that government has taken this idea of the panopticon and of surveillance and really innovated it in a way that is breathtaking and almost hard to believe. So what you have in China is a society where everybody's data, in the way that I described before, instead of getting sucked up to Uber and Bank of America or your bank or Google Maps or Facebook or Twitter, it all goes to one place. And the government can take that and then start shaping people's behavior. This is what is now known as digital authoritarianism, and I think it's one of like the key challenges that we have to face as humans moving forward is how do we prevent this from happening in our countries? To give you an idea of how this works in China, there is an app called WeChat. So WeChat does basically everything I just mentioned, and more than 1 billion people use it. The average user uses it 2, 3, 4, 5 hours a day. So to give you an idea of what's possible using this application, a young woman from Shenzhen wrote this, and she was basically saying that she uses it to message friends, to pay for snacks and water, to buy train tickets, book hotel rooms, order taxis, get takeout, send my aunt photos, pay electricity bills, top up her mobile phone account, make hospital appointments, and even check the weather. So you could do all of these things with WeChat. It sounds pretty great, right? Pretty convenient. Well, what if the government was using this application to spy on you and develop behavioral models to track you? So that's what the Chinese government is doing. So this is their social credit system that they proposed in 2014. This is like the sort of the constitution for what this would look like, and it's the founding document. And it's a plan that is supposed to conclude in 2020 with basically a nationally unified way of tracking everybody's digital information. And the manifesto for this document is an ancient Chinese proverb that says, "Allow the trustworthy to roam everywhere under heaven while making it hard for the discredited to take a single step." So dictatorships used to have to do this manually, right? So Mao would install spies in communities, and obviously this happened across continental Europe, Stasi Germany being a key example. They don't have to do that anymore. It can all be done digitally. So one of the key ways they do this is with what's called a social credit score. So you might be familiar with a credit score, like where I'm from, San Francisco, California, United States. My financial performance is graded by 3 big companies in the US based on how much debt I have, how fast do I pay back my credit cards, how healthy are my financial behaviors, essentially. Contributes to a score, which then I get to, it basically determines what kind of loan I can get, what kind of terms I can get on a mortgage, et cetera. In China, they take the financials and they add in your demographics, who you are, who you're friends with. They even add in any sort of like altercations you've had with the government and even what you've said. So they take all this stuff that I've been talking to you about, all these different things that they can vacuum up about you, and they turn it into one number. So this is like one example, is one particular company has something called the Sesame credit score. So you're somewhere between 350 and 950, and that determines if you can get fast internet, if you can get on an airplane, if you can buy train tickets, if you can send your kids to a private school. So what the Chinese government has figured out is that it's actually better to create incentives for you to be a good citizen than to try and control you with violence. And I think that's a very logical and smart conclusion that other governments are going to follow. This is like the credit score in action. So in one city in China of more than 1 million people, the best scorers get put up on these like posters all across the city so that you want to, look at who's scoring well today and, who's a good citizen. So you actually look up and it tells you who's doing really well, and it's like this sort of competitive game. So again, they've figured out that competition is better than brute force. They've also figured out how to use sticks. So if you do petty crime like jaywalking, in some areas in China, your face and your ID number get put up on a giant screen so that everybody else can see you, and this, of course, shames you into not doing that. So this is a fairly innocent example. We could probably all agree jaywalking's bad, but there's no limit. There's, the slippery slope is not stopping anytime soon in China. And young millennials are at this point where they're conflicted over what their government is building. So one of them said that they can't really tell if they're building a futuristic society or a cage for themselves, as she's using her phone to make a purchase, of course, because phones and applications now can do everything. So there's also radical innovation in other areas of technology that would aid and abet the surveillance state. So of course you've heard about Google Glasses, but what about the application of Google Glasses to police work? Now that might sound interesting for Portugal, but in China, where there's no laws, again, this is a highly centralized political system, there's no independent judiciary, there's no independent legislature, there's no ability for you to hire a lawyer to protect you against a government transgression of your human rights, this happens. So when she looks out, she sees this, and it's basically everything about you, all of your information. So the Chinese government is building about 1 billion of these things, and they want to have it all operational by 2020, and they want to be the world leader in AI by 2030. So if you think about the fact that they have this enormous amount of data and that they have so many skills and resources and talented people all working on AI, you can kind of see where this is going. And they're even experimenting in other areas that you probably haven't even thought about. So this is not a toy. This is actually a surveillance drone that looks like a bird. And when it flies very high in the air, it looks so much like the other birds that other birds actually flock and actually fly next to it. And these are being deployed in more than 30 provinces in China. So, the state-of-the-art, what they call black tech, is really a sight to behold. It's not just bird drones, it's not just smart glasses, it's devices that can crack your phone in seconds and take all of your data off of it. And of course, it's things like the social credit score. And this is leading to an environment where you could essentially have what you had in Minority Report or in many different science fiction novels and fantasies about pre-crime, where the government starts to arrest you before you've committed a crime because they know that you're suspicious in some way. So all this like highly advanced technology, if it's not tied to some moral system, if it's not tied to values, if it's not checked, if we don't have ways to prevent it from going out of control, it will lead to this. And it already has led to this in the world's largest country. So don't think it couldn't happen to you. And it really depends on what you are going to invest in and what you're going to build here in Cascais and in Portugal. We want to make sure there are checks and balances in the technology that we build, and also opportunities for citizens to be involved in this decision making. This is really, really important. Just to drive the point home of what could happen if we don't act now, this is a photo from Xinjiang, which is north of Tibet. It's the farthest northwest province in China, home to about 12 million Uyghurs, who are a Muslim minority in China. And Xinjiang is the most surveilled place on Earth. So if you stray about 100 meters from your home or office, the police are alerted. If you don't install tracking software on your phone, you get arrested. If you pray or grow a beard, you get sent to a prison camp, so, or they call them re-education camps. So this is like a photo of one of these re-education camps from a satellite. And this is something that has been making the news lately, so you might have seen it. But there are now more than 1 million Muslims in these re-education camps in Western China. And just to give you some context, at the height of World War II, the Nazi German government had about 715,000 people in its camps, which of course included death camps, extermination camps, education camps, prison camps, all kinds of camps. The Chinese have more than 1 million Muslims in their camps. So this is something that we should all be addressing and concerned with. This is a massive world crisis that no one's talking about, and it's being aided and abetted by centralized technology. So this is something we should all care about. And of course, it matters for us too. Even if you can't activate the empathy, and most of us can't probably, we don't have time to care about people in China, but what about us? What about people in Portugal, Germany, Spain, United States? All of these things I mentioned earlier, where we're dumping all this data into these third-party companies, we shouldn't be trusting them. First of all, they are selling our data to people without telling us. There are some staggering and jaw-dropping things that Facebook alone has done, where, for example, let's say you actually chose and told Facebook that you didn't want it to share your phone number, and you did give it your phone number. But you gave it your phone number when you did two-factor authentication. So if you wanted to be secure to log into Facebook, you basically wanted it to send you a text. So we found out later that Facebook was taking that phone number that you gave it just for this purpose and then selling it to somebody. So they really have no limit to what they'd like to do with your information. And other organizations can take advantage of that, whether it's other nation states that are seeking to disrupt your politics, or hackers. So in the United States, Equifax is one of these big 3 credit rating agencies, and they were hacked last year, and they lost 140 million addresses and names and social security numbers from Americans. So not only are highly centralized systems very morally exploitable, they're also very security exploitable. So we have to think about that as we build these things out. At the TED conference this year in Vancouver, the most talked about presentation was given by Jaron Lanier, who invented the term virtual reality. So what Jaron Lanier said is that we need to invent a new kind of internet, one that doesn't police every transaction, one where when I send a message to you, no one can make money off of it without my permission, one where we own our stuff. And people got really excited about this talk, like me, because we think it's a way to wake up the world and restructure it in a way where we own our own stuff. Because if you could control your own data, that would make total government surveillance impossible. So it's a combination of like old school human rights advocacy and checks and balances on governments and companies, and technology innovation that's going to bring us to a place where we continue to have freedoms in the future. You're going to need both. Now, getting to that technology part, again, I'm a political scientist, so I've studied why decentralized politics is much better than centralized politics. I think the fruits of democracy are vast. I mean, when you look at the evidence, whether you care about peace, no 2 free nations have ever fought each other in the history of political science. Whether you care about healthcare, education, patent rates, innovation, math, science, all of these things progress faster and deliver more fruits in open societies than in centralized dictatorships. There's lots of evidence for this. So the question is, I mean, and if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? If you're a dictator, you might be able to be very efficient. You can do many transactions per second because you don't need to deal with private property or the media or courts. But in the end, there's a beauty in decentralized systems. There's a beauty in distributing power so that not one person is in control. And we've seen that with even just like Portugal's own story, right? So when it comes to, again, the Carnation Revolution, it's something that you've experienced here over time, that when you go from a highly centralized system where one person makes all the decisions over time to a system where people share those decisions and there's accountability and transparency. Yes, it's a long road. Yes, it's something that takes a long time, but the fruits are really significant and very inspiring. And I think a lot of people around the world still remember that, so you shouldn't forget it. It's pretty amazing. You should be really proud of the country you've started to build here. And this idea of decentralization in politics and thinking about, well, what about technology is so critical. So if you think about Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, he actually says that if you dislike the idea of living in a digital dictatorship, then the most important contribution you can make is to find ways to prevent too much data from being concentrated in too few hands. They won't be easy tasks, he says, but they might be the best way to safeguard our democracy. So again, think about where all your data is, and is there a way for us to start distributing that? This is where Bitcoin enters. So for millennia, for thousands of years, all in human history, when you think about the history of money and currency, when we send money to each other, we've always had to trust a third party or physically do it directly, right? So if you were to send somebody something on Venmo or PayPal, or even mail a check through your bank or put something in escrow, you've always had to trust somebody. You've always had to trust a third party. And again, when you can't trust that third party, when that third party is a dictatorship or a corrupt bank, bad things happen. So in 2008 and 2009, an unknown group of people called Satoshi Nakamoto invented Bitcoin. And now humans have the ability to transact money with no third party in a way that is censorship resistant. So forget everything you've heard about Bitcoin. From my human rights activist point of view, this is why I think it's cool. So I can now send you Bitcoin and no one can stop us. And that's a radical innovation. So much so that, you know, really until Bitcoin was invented, there was, again, no way to send money from me to you without someone in between. You had to trust somebody. You don't have to trust somebody anymore. That's a revolutionary upgrade in how we can communicate. I would urge you to think about it in the way that different revolutions have impacted our ability to network as species. So, of course, 70,000 years ago, there was the cognitive revolution. So we figured out how to tell stories with one another, right? So we could start creating fictive, imaginative tales. And this actually allowed us to break the Dunbar number of 150 people. So before then, before the cognitive revolution, humans couldn't really network beyond about 150 people. About 12,000 years ago, we had the agricultural revolution. So this, of course, brought us into these hierarchical top-down structures. Then 200 years ago, the Industrial Revolution, which took us from just a few hundred million people to 7 billion people in just a few hundred years. So today I'm proposing that the invention of Bitcoin and so many other things that will follow Bitcoin are a new kind of revolution in how humans can network. I wanted to touch briefly on how Bitcoin operates from at least a human rights perspective, because I think it's really important that it follow the same idea of decentralization that we've been talking through during this presentation. So when you look at a democracy, you have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, right? Power is divided. There is no dictator. In Bitcoin, the miners are the people who expend enormous amounts of energy to create new blocks on the Bitcoin blockchain. And for doing so, they are rewarded with Bitcoin. You would say that they have the power. They're kind of like the executive branch. The coders are the people who write the laws, who write the script that updates the language of Bitcoin. So you can kind of think of them as the legislative branch. And then we have the users. So any of you can go home today and download the entire Bitcoin transaction file, the entire ledger historically, and you can start participating in Bitcoin. It's free, it doesn't cost anything. So you would now be a user, and you kind of act as the judicial branch, because it's your decision to upload and update the software that the coders propose, and it's your decision whether or not to accept the new blocks that the miners are producing. So if you can see that Sally has 20 Bitcoins, but she's trying to send 40 to Tom, and you're a user and you're seeing that in the network, you're going to reject that transaction because it's fraudulent. And that's the magic of Bitcoin. It achieves security and it achieves accuracy without a third party. This is something that other technologies are going to start copying, and it's going to become a really important thing for the future of both finance, so many other fields. In the same way that the internet disrupted information, so nation states and newspapers are no longer the only people who control news narratives, Bitcoin is going to disrupt financial monopolies. So banks and nation states will no longer be the only people who control money. So today you can like escape from that duality, and you can have actual ownership of value, and you don't have to trust anyone else. This is, again, a radical innovation, and we're just at the beginning. To take you back to the beginning of Bitcoin, I think it's always important to think about why did someone create this thing which spawned this entire crypto blockchain industry? Well, they left a pretty neat clue. So this is the first block of the Bitcoin blockchain from January 2009. And there's actually some text, this sort of Easter egg that they left for us that says, The Times, the 3rd of January 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout of banks. So this actually refers to this article in the British press about how the British government was just going to sort of print more money to try and get itself out of a financial crisis, which may work in a place like Britain to an extent, but doesn't really work in a place that doesn't have separation of money and state. So in Portugal and Spain and other countries, usually the leader of the executive branch does not control the printing press, and that's a really important distinction. But in dictatorships, places like China and Venezuela, the government controls the printing press, and that opens society up for hyperinflation. So, of course, we've all known about what happened in Germany between the two world wars, where the German government printed so much money that it became worthless. The same thing happened in Zimbabwe about 10 years ago. A friend of mine wears the original Zimbabwean dollar from 1980 around his neck because it used to be worth several British pounds. It became so worthless due to the Mugabe government's economic policies that they actually were printing $100 trillion notes. And now they don't even use this currency anymore at all. The same thing's happening in Venezuela today. So that's how much cash you needed to buy a roll of toilet paper in Caracas last month. You needed all that cash to buy just one roll of toilet paper. Today, you'd need twice as much. That's how fast things are moving. So the International Monetary Fund has said that Venezuela's inflation could reach 1,000,000% by the end of the year. So you started your year on January 1 with $1 million or €1,000,000. You're going to end the year with 1. So this is just devastating for savers, for middle-class people, for consumers. You can see that in 2016, it cost 450 bolivars to buy a cup of coffee. Last year, 4,500. This year, 1.4 million. I mean, so what's happening is people can't trust their currency in Venezuela, which is a significant country of tens of millions of people. So a lot of them are turning to Bitcoin as an escape valve because they can actually store their value in something that the government can't just take away from them. So what you're actually seeing is innovation in decentralized currency happening on the edge, and the edge is not in Lisbon, it's going to be in Caracas. So a lot of these technologies are going to start to be used by people who need them. You have a working financial system. You have the euro. Your money's a store of value. But most people in the world don't have this luxury. So if you look at the world, and this is produced by my organization, the Human Rights Foundation, we've tried to put in red all of the highly centralized governments. So the governments that control everything. You can think about the red ones as the governments that control the military, the printing press, all that stuff. The blue countries have more of a separation of powers. There's more of a distribution of power. And the government typically does not control the printing press in the blue countries. So again, Bitcoin and decentralized technology and networks that are just starting now to be created are most useful where you can't trust your government or banking system. That's an important lesson to take away. To give you like a personal story, my friend Roya Mahbub is an Afghan entrepreneur. So she's one of the first CEOs that's a woman in Afghanistan, and she's a Time 100 leader. And a few years ago, she had to start paying young women that she had taught to code, and she had to start paying them for their work, and she couldn't pay them in cash because the men, the husbands and brothers and uncles of the girls, would actually steal that money when they got home. So that didn't work. They wouldn't even let them open bank accounts. And some software like PayPal or Venmo was like sanctioned because Afghanistan has sanctions. So she figured, how can I pay them? So she started to pay them in Bitcoin. So the young women received the money on their phones, and they actually owned their money. They had control over their money for the first time in their life. That's a big, big deal. One of them actually was forced to leave Afghanistan, sadly, because of a political threat. So she took her phone with her across Iran, Turkey, settled in Germany, and was able to use that Bitcoin, which had luckily appreciated quite a bit, to start her new life. So it can actually give financial freedom to disenfranchised people. That's really important. But for some reason, the authorities really don't like Bitcoin. And I'll try to explain that in there's two reasons, right? So people want to call for a crackdown on Bitcoin. People want to attack Bitcoin. Number one, institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, et cetera, European Central Bank, they're going to lose a lot of power because of this new kind of technology. They're not going to have total control over your money anymore, which is something that they're kind of concerned about. But number two, they're going to try and create their own kind of coin. So when the European Central Bank says, is trying to convince you that Bitcoin's not a currency, it's because they have other plans. They're going to create their own kind of cryptocurrency, I'm sure. Whether it will be called the Euro coin, who knows? This is probably going to happen in the next few years. And the thing that they're not going to tell you is that it's very different from Bitcoin. So when you look at the science of blockchain, how Bitcoin's actually built, it's kind of like the internet itself. It's open, decentralized, permissionless, censorship resistant, right? But the blockchains that the European Central Bank are going to build, the blockchains that big companies are building right now, are kind of like intranets as opposed to the internet. They're closed, they're centralized, they're permissioned, they're censorable. They're not really an innovation. So as business leaders, you should really pay attention to this, because a lot of people are losing a lot of money by sinking a lot of their money into these enterprise blockchains, which from an engineering perspective don't really work. With an enterprise blockchain, you get the worst part of Bitcoin: the inefficiency, the slowness, the way that it's all scattered, the fact that it's not very fast, and you don't get the prime benefit. Censorship resistance is the reason why Bitcoin was created. So if you don't need that, you should probably think twice about adding a blockchain solution to your company or portfolio. Sometimes you might really need that, and it's quite amazing and innovative, and it's something we should look at. But the thing is, governments don't really care. They have a lot of money to burn, and they want to create surveillance technology. So in the case of China, Xi Jinping has said that blockchain is a breakthrough technology. Jack Ma has said that Bitcoin's a bubble. Notice he's trying to attack Bitcoin, but blockchain is for real. And the state television program there said that blockchain is going to be 10 times bigger than the internet. And of course, the Chinese government is really trying to promote this idea of blockchain. So blockchain is just dominating in China. I mean, look how many patents they're filing every year compared to the US or Australia or other countries. But these are blockchains with what they call Chinese characteristics. So they're blockchains with a center. So basically, you have to think about the fact that Chinese government officials have said in interviews that they're trying to create blockchains that don't have decentralization. That's not really for them. Well, that's kind of like saying, well, we're going to have a dictatorship, or we're going to have a democracy, but it's not going to be, we're going to have elections. We're going to not have that. So this is what they're trying to do, which is pretty stunning. Now, other governments around the world are also going to create their own blockchains that they can control. So again, be careful about the word. In Venezuela, the government came up with the Petro, which is a centralized enterprise blockchain that they're going to use to try and control people, even while the people use things like Bitcoin, Zcash, and other decentralized currencies to escape inflation. And then in Saudi Arabia, IBM has said that they're going to help the Saudi government reimagine and transform the way in which services are provided to citizens. Well, I don't know if you read the news this week, but the Saudi Arabian government appears to have assassinated a journalist in Turkey, dismembered this person, put the remains into boxes, and smuggled them out of the country. This is how the Saudi government treats its citizens. So, I mean, I think there's a large amount of morality that we need to start talking about in the technology industry, in the same way that we would talk about oil, gas, other fields. Like if you're going to be excited about building smart cities with the Saudi government, then I think there needs to be a way for you to re-examine what you're doing. I'm not opposed to centralized systems entirely, of course. We have to be rational. Many things will need to continue to be centralized in the future. Police, army, etc. And again, in countries like Portugal or Estonia, maybe it makes sense for you all to centralize everything because you can trust your government, right? But if you live in Estonia and you have set up this amazing virtual residency program and this amazing economic activity where everything is tracked and centralized, what happens if Putin invades tomorrow? So Putin was dancing at the wedding of the Austrian foreign minister a couple months ago. He's already invaded several countries on the periphery of Europe. It's not that outrageous that he could either take over or install some sort of puppet government in Estonia. Then what happens to your virtual residency and economy program? It becomes a tool for him. So a centralized system is only as good as the humans behind it. Very, very important to take away. Now, to go back to where we started, you got to think about money at the very base of the social stack. So payments, I think, are really what we need to focus on when we come to this decentralized technology in the next couple of years. Payments are where centralized systems are really dominating right now. So if you look at China, mobile money is just absolutely scaling at a rate we've never seen before, and people are using it everywhere. And if you think about it, cash, like a euro note, is privacy, it's freedom. If I give you that, it's very hard for the government to track that, right? So we're all moving to cashless societies. And the inventor of digital cash in the 1980s, David Chaum, said that the difference between bad and well-developed digital cash will determine whether we have a dictatorship or a real democracy. Cash and money is so important to everything else in life. If you think about the way that we transact with one another. And now in China, when you give money to a beggar on the street, he's got a QR code, and he's not accepting your paper, your metal money anymore. And this is just a little glimpse into how much the cashless society has permeated in the world's largest country. Again, this could happen anywhere. So we're all going to be moving to cashless societies. Your children will not ever touch physical money, in my belief. I don't think they'll ever use paper and metal money. So what kind of cashless society do they want to live in? Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the famous thinker, has said that Bitcoin's mere existence is an insurance policy that will remind governments that the last object the establishment could control, namely the currency, is no longer a monopoly. This gives us, the crowd, an insurance policy against an Orwellian future. So if someone as prominent as that is saying this about Bitcoin, maybe you should take a look at it. One thing I would encourage you to think about is that these technologies are really new. So just like the phone in 1990, it was expensive, only rich people could use it, the battery life was terrible, the user interface was a disaster, it just wasn't very usable or affordable, and it didn't reach very many people. But over the span of the last 15, 20 years, people in the middle of the desert and jungle and mountains have phones, and they use them to do a lot more than just phone calls. So think about what might happen with this expensive, slow, very limited thing that we have called Bitcoin, which not many people understand or know how to use. Think of it going along this evolution and maybe being able to reach billions of people, which would provide them with economic freedom and might be really something that changes the world. Now, everything is an engineering problem, right? So the main issue with decentralized technology, including Bitcoin today, is that it's slower than centralized technology. So Visa does 2,000 transactions a second. But remember, all of those transactions are censorable. Bitcoin only does 10 a second, but those are very valuable because it's unstoppable. What if we could have something that could take Bitcoin's unstoppability and add exponential scaling to it? So that's another technology that I just want to kind of close with, called Lightning Network, which is kind of a very cool idea. It's invented several years ago. It's a decentralized payment network. And what's really interesting about Lightning Network is it allows us to do almost infinite transactions per second, theoretically. So you know when you go to the bar and you put your credit card down, and then you have like 30 drinks with all your friends, and at the end of the night, you take your credit card back. You've only done 2 transactions with the bar, but you've probably bought 30 drinks. So Lightning Network operates on the same principles. This is a map of all the Lightning Network nodes in the world right now. It's a very new technology. It just launched in March. But the idea is that you can basically start a tab with somebody, maybe it's Amazon, maybe it's a friend, open a payment channel, and then you can go back and forth as many times as you want before you settle. So it's something that allows us to do very many transactions per second, way more than Visa possibly. And it might allow us to achieve something we haven't had yet, which is streaming money. So this idea that we have to wait 2 weeks for a paycheck, or that we have to pay an entire article and buy the whole thing, or buy a movie and buy the whole thing. I mean, why not pay by word or by second? Why not drive your car and pay the municipality taxes every foot? We can't do that right now because we don't have the technology to do so. But just like people said streaming video was impossible in the 90s, well, maybe streaming money is where we're going to go. So decentralized technology can not only help with freedom and human rights and protect us from the surveillance state, but it can also innovate our society in some amazing ways, and it could be very lucrative for people who start to understand it in an early way. But if we don't explore and invest in this area, if we continue to stay on the centralized track and not care about the fact that all of our data is being sucked up and owned by other people, the WeChat model will win. It will win here in Portugal, I guarantee it, if we don't do something else. When we talk about decentralization and this story of decentralization and why it's so important, we have to close with this image. So this is actually an image from the sky, from a satellite, of the Korean peninsula, okay? So that's actually North Korea, that's South Korea. These were the same people 70 years ago, okay? So they were under the same Japanese occupation, they went through the same war, and this is where they are today. And the only difference is centralization. So North Korea is just darkness. It's basically one point of light that is the Kim family and all of their friends, and they live like in the Hunger Games in the capital. Everybody else lives in District 12 with nothing. In the South, on the other hand, has decentralization of governance. They have human rights, rule of law, they have all kinds of freedoms, and they even have the ability to kick out their leaders peacefully and put them in prison. And they have LG and Hyundai and Samsung, and they've made so much of what you experience on your day-to-day basis. The South Koreans are an amazing people, and look what they've accomplished. The difference between these two societies is decentralization. This is how important it is. This is just evidence that it's something we should be thinking about as we build the technology of the future. I wanted to read this with you to close today. It's another quote by Yuval Noah Harari, who I think will continue to become a really important public intellectual for all of us to think about and listen to. He says, "The algorithms are watching you right now. They are watching where you go, what you buy, who you meet. Soon they will monitor all your steps, all your breaths, all your heartbeats. They're relying on big data and machine learning to get to know you better and better. And once these algorithms know you better than you know yourself, they could control and manipulate you, and you won't be able to do much about it. You live in the Matrix or the Truman Show. In the end, it's a simple empirical matter. If the algorithms understand what's happening within you better than you, authority will shift to them." Of course, you might be perfectly happy ceding all authority to the algorithms and trusting them to decide things for you and for the rest of the world. If so, just relax and enjoy the ride. You don't need to do anything about it. The algorithms will take care of everything. If, however, you want to retain some control of your personal existence and of the future of life, you have to run faster than the algorithms, faster than Amazon and the government, and get to know yourself before they do. To run fast, don't take much luggage with you. Leave all your illusions behind. They're very heavy. I love this quote because, number one, it continues to drive home this point that it's so important what kind of technology we build and how we build it. But number two, keep an open mind. I've said a lot of things today that you probably don't agree with, or you're like, he's crazy with all these Bitcoin theories. Well, the good news is you can just leave your illusions behind and go home and read about it online. Listen to some podcasts. Start digging into it. I think you'll be very satisfied with what you learn. I think we have to think of ourselves as students. I'm a student every day. I learn more about decentralized technology, Bitcoin, and how it matters for human rights and freedom, and I think you can too. And together, I think we can fight the panopticon, and we can invest in decentralized technology. So thanks so much for listening to me. I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you. Thank you.